This quilt pattern is going to become a new favorite of yours to sew, and I cannot wait to see all of the different fabric, print, and color combinations you come up with. Hi, my name is Fallon and I love to quilt. And today I'm sharing a new quilt pattern with you. This pattern was inspired by Monique from Open Gate Quilts Tilted Charm Patterns. This pattern will be available on my website, and the pattern will have information for 2 different quilt sizes. 3 different quilt blocks will bring this quilt together. I will be showing you how to make the 9-patch chain block, the left dancing star block, and the right dancing star block. Let's start by making the 9-patch chain block. All right, so here is the 9-patch chain block. You will start by making 4 patches that are in a checkerboard pattern, and you'll need to make 4 of them to bring this block together. And then once you get those, the block comes together really quickly. You can see that there are 9 patches here, and it creates a chain, which is why I'm calling it the 9-patch chain block. So let me show you what you need to make this block. So to make this block, you're going to need 8 2-inch squares that are of background fabric, 8 2-inch squares that are print fabric, a 3.5-inch accent square, just one of these, and then 4 3.5-inch background squares. And that's all you need to bring just one of these blocks together. Now you can see here that I cut my 2-inch squares into squares. However, you can use a different method to bring this block together if you prefer. So if you would like, you could cut your fabric into 2-inch by width of fabric strips. I have this trimmed down just for ease of showing you, but you could make really long strips of the print and the background fabric. So 2-inch strips, and then you could just cut them down into 2-inch segments and bring them back together to make the 4-patch. So you would just cut to get a nice straight edge, cut a 2-inch strip. I'm just using the mat here just for ease of showing. So you would have your 2-inch strips, and then you would just bring it together to a 4-patch. So you would sew across there and press it, and you would have your 4-patch, and that's a method to do this. If you want to ensure that everything is nice and even, honestly, in that case, I feel like the easiest thing to do is to just cut your 2-inch squares. You're going to get it nice and even every time. I feel like if you're sewing really, really long strips, sometimes things can get wonky and uneven. So the easiest way I feel like to get everything to turn out really nice and perfect is to cut the 2-inch squares. And that way you could also use scraps and make this a scrappy quilt if you wanted to. But in the end, just do the method that works best for you. If you want to do the strip method, you'll get about 20 or 21 of those little 2-patch segments each time you sew the 2-inch by width of fabric strips. Now, if you're cutting 2-inch squares like I'm going to show here, then you'll need to cut what I directed in the pattern. All right, so you'll lay out your 4 patches just like I'm showing here. You'll have a print and a background, and then a background and a print. So you'll place a print and a background right sides together, and then you'll sew a 1/4-inch seam. Once you finish your 2 patches, press your seam toward the print fabric. If you press all of your seams toward that print fabric, when you go to sew your 4 patches, your seams will nest so that you reduce the bulk in your 4 patches. All right, so I have my print squares and my 2-inch squares, and I'm just going to start sewing them together into little 2 patches. So I'm just going to take one of my prints and one of my background fabrics, place them right sides together. Now my background fabric is solid, so there really isn't a right or a wrong side, but if you're using a tone-on-tone or something like that, you will want to pay attention to make sure you have right sides together. And then I'm just going to sew a 1/4-inch seam along here. Now I'm just going to chain piece these, so I'm just going to keep placing these squares right sides together, taking one print and one background fabric, and just sewing that 1/4-inch seam. So I'll end up having 8 of these little 2-patch strips. Now, if you're choosing to do that strip method right now, instead of sewing all these together, you'll be sewing a long width of fabric strip that sews together a print and a background fabric. If you don't want to work block by block, you could do this step through all of your 9-patch chain blocks. You could just have all of these ready, all of them that you need for all of the 9 patches you'll need in your quilt, and just sew them all right here. Why do I like to chain piece these? So one, I feel like I'm getting this whole step done at one time. So I'm not doing just one of these, pressing it, then going back to sewing. I can sew all of them at one time. I call it production sewing. It means that I am getting all of one step done all at once. And I think it makes it a lot easier for me. I can just get in the zone and keep sewing here. Another thing that is really helpful here is because I'm leaving that thread together, I feel like I'm wasting less thread because I'm not cutting it off over and over again. And also I don't have to worry about any of the edges of my blocks kind of getting sucked down into the machine. On this one, it doesn't happen as much because the hole under here isn't as large. This is just a straight stitch machine, so it doesn't need that room to do a zigzag stitch or anything like that. It does happen sometimes though, primarily with triangles, but keeping it all together like this means I'm not getting anything pulled into the machine, and I'm not getting that bunch of thread under the fabric. There's a lot of things that doing it this way really helps prevent. All right, so I have my chain of cute little 2 patches here. So I'm just going to cut them apart. I have this thread cutter here that works really well. You can just use your snips or whatever you have on hand. Your machine may even have a thread cutter on it that works just as well too. There's a lot of different ways you can just cut these apart really efficiently. All right, so now that I have them all cut apart, something I like to do is, like I said, we're going to press all of these toward the print fabric. So I go ahead and start doing that now. This is really important if you're doing half square triangles or something like that. I feel like it really helps not warp the block as much, but I like to do it here as well. I feel like it just gets the seam kind of going in the direction that you want. And I find that it's really helpful to not press the block really wonky, because you can really feel that you have it folded where the seam needs to be. It's just one of those steps that I feel like really helps you get a nice finished block in the end. All right, so I have all these finger pressed. They're ready for heat to be added to them. So I'm going to use my iron. I usually just use a dry iron to press these. If the seam doesn't seem to want to be setting nice and flat for some reason, I'll add a little bit of starch to it if I need to. So far, I haven't really used any starch on this quilt aside from at the very beginning. I starched all of my fabrics then with just a light starch and press them all really well, but I haven't had to add any more starch to any of these seams. Everything has been nice and flat from the starch I added at the beginning. All right, so now these are pressed really beautifully. This seam is pressed toward the print fabric, and I think they're laying pretty nicely. I just pressed with the dry iron and then put the clapper on them for a little bit to make sure that seam laid nice and flat. So now we're going to take these little 2 patches is what I've been calling them, and lay them right sides together, but you want to make sure the pattern makes that checkerboard pattern. So you're going to want your print to lay on top of a background fabric and the background fabric to lay on top of a print fabric. So you're alternating them, and then the nice thing is if you press them all to the print fabric, those seams will nest really nicely together, and you can actually feel that they kind of butt up against each other and everything is laying nice and flat, it will reduce bulk in the quilt for you. So these are laying together really nicely. So I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. This is a really small little block, so I'm actually not too worried about it shifting around too much. I feel like I can hold it pretty well and make sure it feeds through nicely. You can always add a pin in here if you feel like you want to at the seam to make sure it you get that nice point there. So again, I'm just going to chain piece all 4 of these for this block. So I'm going to grab 2 more, put them right sides together, make sure I have opposing fabrics facing each other, make sure it's right sides together. I have sewn many a block together with one right side facing a wrong side and had to pull out the seam ripper and rip that out. So that can happen. Now, let me show you, let me see if this one does it and just show you what I do if it happens. So if you can hopefully see here, my fabric is not lined up perfectly together. So either I had not sewn a very careful 1/4 inch seam, or I didn't cut perfectly. Whatever it is, you can see there it's a little bit off here. I don't focus on that. What I focus on is the point is going to show up more here than having the fabric lined up straight. So I focus on that seam meeting together, and I don't so much worry about that the fabric's a little bit off here. I'll just compensate later in the pattern if I need to make sure things line up perfectly. So that's kind of how I approach that when things aren't lining up perfectly. The point matters more to me. So again, I'm just chain piecing through here. So this one lines up pretty nicely. Well, on that side it didn't, but either way, I make sure the point, the seams come together there so I can get a nice point. All right, so again, I'm going to cut these apart. All right, and again, I'm going to finger press them. You know, when I first started quilting, I never used the iron. I don't like to iron. I never iron clothes. I am a person who throws clothes back in the dryer to try to get wrinkles out if there are a lot of wrinkles. And it's just not my thing. But the more I learned as I started quilting more, the more I realized how important pressing is, how important some of these little kind of more monotonous steps to quilting are. And when I understood the importance of them more, the more I enjoyed doing them because I could see the results from them. All right, so I have these all pressed now, and these are all laying beautiful, perfect. And I don't feel like I need to add any starch to any of these to get them to lay flat. So now we can bring the block together. And this is the fun part for me when I'm really seeing how the block is going to look, how the fabrics are all going to work together, because you kind of have an idea in mind sometimes. You picked out the fabrics, but really seeing it together in the block really brings everything together, and now you know if your idea is going to work or if it's not going to quite look like maybe what you wanted it to. All right, so here is the layout for the block. You're going to have your 4 patches out in the corner, your accent fabric in the center, and then those background fabrics are going to fill in the rest of the space. Now, one thing I want to share with you, and I wish I had thought about it before I cut up the fabric, is if you have extra fabric for that center accent, if you're using something that's floral or some sort of design that would fit into a 3.5 inch square nicely, you may want to fussy cut it. It would look so good here. So I did try to pick out some of the florals that are nice and filling up that area. Still looks great either way, but I wish I had thought of that beforehand to really fussy cut around those flowers. I think it would look so good. So the design board I grabbed doesn't quite fit this really well, but I really like laying my blocks out when I can on a design board. It really helps me make sure I sew these properly. Because if you notice, you really want those print fabrics pointing into that center accent, just like I'm showing here. All right, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew it together. All right, so I'm going to start at the first row and take the 4-patch and a background fabric, place them right sides together, and sew a 1/4-inch seam. This block really comes together really fast at this point. So instead of cutting my thread here, I'm going to go to the second row and take the background fabric and the accent fabric and place them right sides together and sew a 1/4-inch seam. And then I'm going to take the third row's fabrics, the 4-patch and the background fabric, and place them right sides together and sew a 1/4-inch seam. I'm just going to make sure the orientation is fine for that 4-patch. Make sure it's aiming in toward the center accent square. So here, this time, I'm not going to cut the threads. Now, if you don't like netting your blocks or doing any of that method, that is fine. You do not have to do it this way. Bring the block together the way you feel comfortable. I am going to finger press the top row so that the seam faces that background square. Then I'm going to finger press the second row so that the accent fabric is facing toward the background fabric. And then the bottom row again is going to face away, the seam is going to face away from the 4-patch. Now, this I find just lets these seams lay a lot more flat. If I'm pressing toward the 4-patch, all those seams are going to come together. There's going to be 4 seams laying through the 4-patch, and I just don't want that. So although I don't typically love to press towards background fabric, if I can avoid it here, I feel like I need to, so I do. So now I'm just going to add on the final row here. So I'm going to take that 4-patch. Again, you can lay it out, make sure everything's facing right, make sure those prints are facing toward that accent fabric, and I'm going to place it right sides together and sew a 1/4-inch seam. And then I'm going to do the same with the next background square. So this is on the middle row. And then again with the final 4-patch. Lay it next to it, make sure it's facing the right direction. Place it right sides together and sew. All right, and so I'm going to finger press all of these seams. So the seams are going on the first row are going to press in toward that middle square, then out away from that middle square, and then in toward the middle square on the third row. Okay, and they're all actually laying pretty good from the finger pressing, probably because I used starch a little bit at the beginning, but I'm going to press these seams, make sure they're laying nice and flat, and then I'll bring the block together. All right, so the seams are laying pretty nice and flat right now, so I'm just going to sew the block together. You can see that it's holding together by those threads, and the nice thing with doing it this way is that it keeps everything in the orientation you want it. So it's a lot harder after you press for things to get mixed up. It can be kind of frustrating having it all hanging together and making sure things line up right when you go to sew. So I completely understand if you don't like to and want to cut those threads, do that. Do it however makes you happy. So I'm just going to feel where these seams are, line it up. Again, because we pressed everything in opposite directions, it nests together really well. If you want to pop some pins in, go ahead and do that. And sew the 1/4-inch seam, just making sure those little seams lay the direction I wanted to. Sometimes I have to guide them to make sure they don't flip in the other direction when I'm sewing across. And yes, I do realize if I put a pin in there, I can hold it in place with that. All right, and then here, the way the quilt comes together, you can press these seams however they're wanting to lay. So these feel like they're wanting to lay toward the center, so I'm just going to finger press it in that direction, let them lay the way that makes it happy. The block that's going to go next to this is going to kind of have a border around it, so it you don't have seams that need to meet up between the blocks, so it makes it a little bit easier for pressing at this stage. So you can kind of press the way the fabric wants to lay on its own. So we're just sewing across the final seam in this block, 1/4 inch seam. And then we'll press, these really want to lay pressing in. I'm guessing because those 4 patches have all that bulk there already. So just press the way the block wants to. All right, so I'm gonna press that with the iron, get it nice and flat, and I'll show you how the block looks, and then we'll look at the left dancing star block. All right, so here is the 9-patch chain block all finished, and it is looking really good. So make as many of them as you want to bring this quilt together. If you decided to go ahead and download my pattern, it will give you instructions for 2 different sizes and exactly how many of these blocks you need to make. All right, so the next block I want to show you is the left dancing star block. So one of my favorite blocks is the Sawtooth Star block, and when I started doing Monique's Open Gate Quilt Tilted Charms pattern, I love the tilted look of blocks, and I thought, why not put my favorite, one of my favorite, I have so many favorite quilt blocks, I say that all the time, one of my favorite quilt blocks into a tilted design like that. And so that is how this pattern was kind of born. So to make this block, you're going to first make the Sawtooth Star and then add the border around it. Now, I want to note to you that these 2 blocks are pretty much constructed in the same way. So I'm calling this the left dancing star because the star block is kind of tilted to the left and then this one is tilted to the right. And the star is constructed first in the exact same way. So I'm only going to show you how to make the Sawtooth Star once, but I'll show you how to sew on both borders. So hopefully that makes sense. If you want to see the star constructed again, you can always go back and watch that step again and then add the border on. So while these instructions are going to be to bring together the left dancing star, the star is going to be constructed in the same way, and I'm going to show you that now. All right, so here is everything you need to bring the left dancing star block together. Now I'm going to point out the items that you need just for the star first. So you're going to need a fabric that you chose for the star points, and you're going to cut 4 3-inch squares and then cut them along the diagonal once. Then you'll need a background fabric that is cut to a 4.5-inch square, and you're going to cut it along the diagonal twice. For the center of the star, I used the same accent fabric as in the 9-patch chain block. And this is a 3.5-inch square, you just need 1. And then you'll need 4 background fabrics cut to 2-inch squares. So that is everything you need for the Sawtooth Star. Now I'm also going to go ahead and show you now what you need for the border on this block, but I will refer to it again later as well. I just want to show you everything all at once for this block. So for the border around the block, you're going to need 2 rectangles. These rectangles are going to be cut to 4-inch by 10-inch rectangles. And then you're going to cut them along the diagonal once, but the way you cut this block along the diagonal is very, very important for how the block tilts. So this rectangle is going to be cut from the top left corner down to the bottom right corner, and you will do that on both of them. So we're going to use these later after we construct the Sawtooth Star block. So I'm going to set them to the side. All right, so the first thing we're going to need for this block is those background triangles. So there are our background triangles, and then we are going to need 4 of the star point triangles. So we're going to take these over to the sewing machine and we're going to lay them right side together. And you're going to line up the triangle for the star point right along one side of the background triangle. So you see how I have the bottom of the triangle lined up together, and then I'm allowing it to hang off the top here. This is very important because you're going to want that 1/4 inch seam at the top. Now, I always oversize these for the finished size that I want because I like to make sure I can trim these flying geese perfectly down to size, because that's what we're making here. We're making a flying geese block and we're going to make 4 of them. So I oversize these. If you have a method to get a 2 inch by 3.5 inch flying geese that you like better, go ahead and use that here. There are so many different methods for getting flying geese, and we're going to be making a lot of them for this quilt. So if you have a favorite method, definitely go with that method. This is how I like to make them, and I like to oversize them partly because I don't like cutting 1/8 inch squares and 1/4 inch squares and all that. So yeah, this is the way I like to do it, the method I like. There's a ton of different ways to do it. So I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along all 4 of these that I'm going to be making. And then I'm going to press the fabric and then take those other 4 star points and sew them along the other side. Once I get both of them sewn on, I'm going to press them really well and then trim them down to size. All right, so let's sew these triangles into place along one side. So we're sewing 4 of the star point triangles onto one side of those background triangles. So again, we're making sure to line up the triangles along the bottom and allowing the top of the star point to hang off of the background triangle here. Ooh, I'm laying them the wrong way. What am I doing? All right, so let's lay these together, line them up, and sew. All right, so I'm going to trim these apart. And then again, these especially, I think it's important if you have the extra time to gently finger press that triangle over. That's, you know, that fabric is so stretchy through there. So doing this really helps make sure this block doesn't warp. I like to oversize these here because if I do skip that step, if I just don't feel like doing it that day when I'm sewing, if I just want to get this block together fast, having it oversized kind of helps because when I trim it down, I have a little bit of extra fabric around there to make sure that I can get the proper size I need from warping that could have happened. So there we go. So I'm going to add some heat to this, and then I'm going to sew the other triangle onto the other side to form this flying geese. All right, so I'm going to sew these triangles onto the other side. They're nice and pressed flat and ready to go. So again, you see that I'm making 4 of these and I'm just chain piecing them together. It just really helps me work in this manner. It works for my brain. I like getting it all done at once instead of sewing one and then pressing it. If that's the way that works for you, do it that way. I think there's room for all of us who like to sew our own particular way. All right, so I'm going to cut these threads apart. And you guessed it, I'm going to finger press these over. And you can see here that I have plenty of room for a 1/4 inch seam. I mean, there is a ton of room there to make sure I can trim this down to size and get this flying geese to look perfect. Now again though, I know a lot of you don't like to waste the fabric, and completely understand. There are so many methods for how to cut your fabric to have no waste flying geese. However you feel more comfortable sewing these, as long as you get the proper size, it'll work out. All right, so now that these are all pressed, they are looking really, really good, but we still need to trim them down to size. So I like to use my Flying Geese trim lock here. It's 3.5 inches by 2 inches, so perfect to get these down to the size. So there are lines here that help me line up where this background fabric is. So I'm gonna line that up there. And then it also has a 1/4 inch line around, so I can make sure that that points at the top and I have the 1/4 inch seam allowance around it. And then I'm just going to trim around all sizes. I don't have to move it around, which is nice. I can just twist, it brings the fabric width, and trim along all sides. So it makes it super easy using that. And there we go. We got my perfect little flying geese. So I just need to trim down all 4 of these to get all of the flying geese I need for 1 block. So just trim along all sides. There we go. And now I just have 2 more to trim. All right, and just like that, I have my 4 perfectly sized flying geese. So I'm going to show you how to bring this block together now. All right, so I have the center accent square, and then I have my 4 flying geese lined up around it. You can see that I have the part of the flying geese that has the star points all lined up facing that center accent. And then in the corners, we have the 4 2-inch background squares that will bring this block together. I'm going to sew it together in the same manner that I did that 9 patch, because you can see, even though these aren't perfectly sized squares, like in the 9 patch, all the seams will still come together in the same way. It's kind of a 9 patch idea, just size different. So we're going to sew it together in the same manner that I did before, where I netted everything. It helps me keep everything lined up, and we'll bring the star together, and then I'll show you how to border it. All right, so in row 1, we're going to take that little background square and the flying geese and place them right sides together. You want to make sure that star point is facing up. And sew that 1/4 inch seam. Then you're going to take the first 2 blocks in the next row, the star points. Make sure the star point is facing away from that center block, and then the long part of the pattern fabric for the star points is right up against that accent square in the center. And then sew the first little square and the flying geese together in the bottom row. All right, and then we're going to press our seam. So we're going to press the first row, we're going to press that seam toward the corner little accent square. In the center, we're going to press toward the large accent square in the center, and then on the bottom row, press toward that little square again. Now we're going to sew the final block in this row on. So the first row, we're going to do the small background square, and then the final flying geese, and then the final little background square. And then press the seams just as before. We're going to press out toward the background square, press in toward the center accent square, and then press out toward the background square. And then we're going to press all the seams with heat as well. All right, and then everything is laying really nice and flat. So we're going to bring this star together just as before, lay it together, kind of feel the seams, pop some pins in if you need to. and just sew a 1/4 inch seam along here. Again, because we're going to add that border around it, you can kind of just let it decide which way it wants the seams to be pressed. I just press the way that fabric's really wanting to go here. Then sew that final row together on this block. And again, press the seam the way the fabric seems to be wanting to go. So I'm pressing in toward the center accent fabric. All right, and so I'm gonna add some heat to this block and get it all pressed nice and flat, and I'll show you how to add on that border. Okay, so remember here, for the left dancing star block, we're going to need one of our sawtooth star blocks and then our border pieces. And to get our border pieces, we have a 4" by 10" rectangle that is cut from the top left to the bottom right. So 2 of them to get 4 pieces. Now here's how we bring this block together. You're first going to take one border piece, lay it right sides together on one side of your star block. You're going to want it laying over about 1 inch. So line that up. My block's a little wonky. Don't worry about it. We're going to trim this down. So as long as you get the border pieces on, it's fine. Now, so we have this lay here. We have it hanging over a little bit. You see the thinner edge of the triangle is hanging off a lot. That is fine. Let that hang off. You're going to want to start sewing 1 inch to 1.5 inches away from the top of the wide edge. And that's away from the start of the sawtooth star. So I'm not measuring 1.5 inches from the top of the border piece. It's 1 inch to 1.5 inches away from the sawtooth star block. So I'm kind of marking here. That is where I'm going to start sewing down this seam 1/4 inch. The block is wonky. Yep, it is. I didn't do a great job sewing here. I'm not going to worry about it. Just going to make sure I catch all the seams sewing down here. So I'm going to get that sewed in place and I'm going to press it, and then I'll show you what we're going to do next. All right, when I start sewing at that line I marked, I back stitch to make sure it holds in place nicely. And then I just sewed off the edge of the bottom of that star, and then I'm going to finger press and press that seam with heat. So I have that first border piece on. We have an opening here, and we have this thinner edge that's hanging off. I'm going to trim that off. And then we're going to take the next border piece, lay it right sides together, and you're going to want to lay maybe about 1/4 inch off one edge, and you get to sew down the whole side this time. The rest of them you sew down the whole side. It makes it a lot easier from now on. So I'm going to sew that, press it, and then we're going to trim that off. Sew the next one on, press it, trim the thin point off on that one, and then I'll show you how to sew on that final border piece. All right, I feel like this part, the most important thing is to remember to lay the border piece with the wider edge of the triangle over that 1/4 inch. It really helps you make sure you have enough space to square up this block. All right, so I pressed it and trimmed off that edge, and I'm going to sew on the third border piece. Let that hang over about 1/4 inch. This is right sides together, and sew that 1/4 inch seam. Now again, I'm going to trim off that thin edge, just squared up with the sawtooth star block. Now this method will be very familiar to you if you're doing Monique's tilted charm patterns for open gate quilts. It's a very, very similar method, pretty much the same method. If you don't know what that is, I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. They are so much fun to sew. All right, so we have 3 of the border pieces sewn on, and so now we just need to do that final one. And the most important thing here is to pull that first one that we put on and didn't sew all the way down out of the way. I had to check. The fabric is actually pretty on both sides. So lay it right sides together, about 1/4 inch off the top here. Sew your 1/4 inch seam, press it, trim it off, and then you will just sew this final piece down and press it. That brings this block together. The border seems a little harder than it actually is. After you sew the first one on, you'll completely get it. All right, so let's sew this final border piece in place. Just sewing a 1/4 inch seam across here. I'm making sure that first border piece is out of the way. All right, so I'm gonna press the seam. Now I have that first one, that little gap that was left there. I need to sew that in place. And I still need to trim off that little piece there, so let's do that. And then here is my block. I'm going to press it really well, and then I'm going to trim it up. All right, so here is the finished-ish block. We still need to trim it up. It is looking so cute. So you can see it is tilted to the left. And I find a rotating cutting mat works best here, and a ruler that is sized to 9.5 inches. So I have a 9.5 inch trim lock here. I'm going to line it up, make sure all edges have some fabric hanging over. Since this block is meant to tilt, I don't worry too much about where the block lies. I think it's going to look fun however it turns out. So trim, rotate, trim, rotate, trim, rotate, trim, and there you go. So there is our left dancing star block, and then next I'll show you how to make the right dancing star block. So for the right dancing star, we're going to start with that same sawtooth star for the center, and then you will still need 2 4-inch by 10-inch rectangles, but this time note that you will need to cut it on the diagonal starting from the top right and going down to the bottom left for both. So you're just cutting it in a different direction. And then once you have the 4 triangles, you'll see that this time when you start sewing the first one on, you're going to want to overhang the wider edge of the triangle on the bottom of the sawtooth star. The thinner edge of the triangle is going to hang off at the top of the block. You're going to have 1 inch overhang on the wider edge, and you're going to start sewing and stop about 1.5 inches before the edge of the sawtooth star block. So about right here, you'll stop sewing. So once you sew along here, press the seam, and then you're going to lay the next block on just like before, hang it over 1/4 inch, sew, press, and then you're going to trim off the small edge of the triangle. Add the next one on, sew, press, add the next one on, and make sure you pull the block out of the way. after you finish all of the blocks for this quilt, for the desired size quilt you would like, lay them all out and stand back, take some photos, make sure the layout is correct. Then you'll want to sew all of the rows together. Bring the quilt top together, and then all you'll have to do is baste, quilt the quilt as desired, and add your binding. This quilt just makes me so happy to look at. It really makes me feel like I'm relaxing at the beach. But I do think this quilt will work with so many different color schemes. I will link to the pattern in the description of this video, and if you do decide to make this quilt, I would love for you to share photos with me on my Facebook page or on Instagram. I would love to see them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!